Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's conversation. I'm Serena Oduro, Policy Manager at Data and Society in charge of our state policy work, and I'm really excited today for our Databite 164 on 404 Job Not Found, the AI literacy trap at work. I also want to say thank you to our events team for their lovely work putting this together today, and really excited to dive into this conversation with our lovely group of panelists. Uh, if for those who don't know Data and Society, we're a research institute focused on the social and cultural implications of AI. And as a research institute, we also do a lot of policy conversations as well, especially where our research is policy relevant. I'm really excited because this conversation is really rooted in Anuli's report for Job Not Found, What Workforce Training Can't Fix for Black Atlantans in the Age of AI. Her report really dives into the question of AI literacy, but actually examining it from looking at the experience of Black Atlantans on the ground, attempting to accrue AI competency and AI skills. And in it, finding an ecosystem that's often tinted in mystery with AI literacy being ill-defined and the paths to reaping the benefits of AI literacy being unclear. I was very excited once I read, Anuli's report internally to co-author a policy brief, really taking the findings from the report and creating a policy brief called 404 Job Not Found, how government can help AI education deliver real benefit for workers, and really highlighting policy recommendations that policymakers can take if they're seeing AI literacy and the push for it, but actually trying to transform it into a way that actually benefits workers. Within that, we really talk about defining what AI literacy is, empowering workers through ensuring that AI literacy efforts are funded to actually provide paid training opportunities, ensuring that AI literacy programs actually lead to good jobs and not just training that doesn't actually go anywhere meaningful for workers, and expanding the stakeholders who are involved in actually designing AI literacy programs. This conversation is ever relevant. It's actually very interesting. Friday, the Department of Labor actually released its AI literacy framework, and they actually define AI literacy in the framework as a foundational set of competencies that enable individuals to use and evaluate AI technologies responsibly, with a primary focus on generative AI, which is increasingly central to the modern workplace. I found this definition interesting, and the AI literacy framework that the Department of Labor just put out interesting as well, because it really focuses on generative AI technologies. And due to that, also focusing on workers' abilities to really prompt generative AI technologies well in ways that are integrated into the workforce, such as writing, drafting reports, scheduling things, really ways that generative AI technologies can be integrated into, the workforce and the daily work life. But within that, it was kind of clear that while AI literacy to them was about people being able to know how to prompt AI systems, it's not really about workers being able to shape AI systems to actually engage in ways that kind of make them actually able to engage in a more critical way. It was also interesting because even though it talks about the way that AI could be used in a manner that um, workers can use and maybe engage with the new generative AI tools that are coming out, it still doesn't really address how AI literacy actively presents an economic opportunity for workers. To me, it's still really addressing that question of, don't get left behind, but not how is this actually helping us get new jobs or actually improve economically. And I really appreciate Anuli's report because she really dives into the importance of that, of workers actually getting economic opportunity, not just not being left behind in our AI era. And so, with this, I'm very happy to introduce our panelists because they really have the wealth of expertise needed to dive into the topic of AI literacy in a more critical way. First, I'm very happy to introduce Anuli Akanegbu, who's the author of the report and a researcher with Data and Society's Labor Futures program, where she leads projects that explore the intersections of labor, race, and technology. Guided by Octavia Butler's directive to tell stories filled with facts, her work traces how Black workers navigate structural inequality, technological change, and economic instability, drawing on ethnographic fieldwork and archival research to show how labor, policy, technology, and the virtual and physical spaces of cities shape how people live and work. Tim Newman is the Senior Vice President of Labor Programs at TechEquity, where he leads the organization's research and advocacy focus on the tech industry's impact on work and labor. Very excited for Tim to be here because he recently authored AI and Workforce Development, building a secure, equitable future for tech workers, which really highlights a worker-centered solution and really challenges the idea that workers can just reskill and upskill alone to save themselves or achieve economic opportunity. Instead, really highlights the structural changes and broader economic policies that have to be pursued to uplift workers. And we also have Annabel Rothschild, who's an assistant professor of computer science at Bard College. Her research centers the who, when, where, how, and why of data set creation, focusing on how the data sets used to train and refine AI systems come into being and the values and attitudes they represent. She also co-founded DataWorks, a worker-first program that Anuli highlights in her report as a true example of digital skilling that addresses workers' needs. So I'm very excited to have you here to also go into the details of what it actually means to actually skill workers in a way that empowers them. To get this conversation started, obviously, Anuli, your report is so poignant. It just released, and you've had a lot of great conversations right from it. And it's really inspiring the conversation for today. So I'd like to hand it to you first. And especially this concept of AI literacy, I think it can seem like, yeah, people should be AI literate. Like when people should know what's happening. But your report really dives into really thinking of it in a critical way. And so I would like to hear for you, and also your report deeply questions the attentions, concept, and benefits of AI literacy. So I'd love if you could tell us more about the concept of AI literacy and what your research reveals about it. And especially if you can sprinkle in, especially with the Department of Labor just putting out their own definition of AI literacy, how you think about that with the way that your report so deeply dives into the conceptions of it.
Absolutely, and thank you for the question. So my report critiques the framing of the skills gap as a narrative that suggests that unemployment or underemployment results from individual deficits rather than systemic inequality. So the discourse around AI literacy is currently at the center of this skills gap narrative. Instead of treating AI literacy like a static skill set, I describe it in the report as a social and political construct that is shaped by funder priorities, employer expectations, and these cultural narratives about innovation. And I also argue that AI literacy lacks a clear definition. I guess we have a definition. The argument is still out on how clear it is, but I will say, having read the report, it's about a 15-page document, but most people have probably seen like the two infographics that they released that essentially summarize if it's you see the infographics, you basically get the gist of it. I think the release of the Department of Labor's AI literacy framework really just affirms the findings of my study that there was previously not a working definition for AI literacy or express content areas for AI skills developments. They even note things I discussed in the report, like the lack of clarity around terms like AI proficiency and AI fluency. And of course, the idea that when many people refer to AI, like, civil people, they are generally referring to generative AI tools. So even in that 15-page document, they acknowledge that it is itself a starting point that will evolve over time. So it's really notable that it just happened to come out right after my report that really asks, why don't we have this clarity? And we have something, but I wouldn't say it's full clarity because, as they say, it's a starting point.
Absolutely. And I was saying earlier with Amelia, I was like, their ears were burning when they knew that this panel was happening because it came out right before it. And yeah, it is interesting, like you said, the kind of range of actors in the background who are kind of influencing this direction or lack of direction with AI literacy. Also, will note, as highlighted in the chat, unfortunately, Senator Merritt will not be able to attend today. She has been brought to the floor unexpectedly and won't be able to leave. But, we're glad that she is an advocate in this conversation, and we're excited to dive further into this with our panelists. Um, with that, with Tim, thinking about AI literacy, and again, rejecting the notion that workers can just upskill and reskill alone, and that there actually need to be broader protections put into place to actually uplift workers. I was wondering if you could speak more about your report AI and workforce development, building a secure, equitable future for tech workers, and more of those like worker-centered solutions that you really bring forth.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Congratulations to Anuli on this really fantastic report. I hope that everyone is, if you haven't read it yet, which hopefully everyone has, carve out some time right after this to really dig into the report. and obviously the policy brief with Serena as well, which provides lots of concrete ideas of how to take this research and apply it. But yeah, I think like the idea of like approaches that center workers really contrasts with I think the dominant narrative right now that we're seeing with AI in the workplace, which is that tech CEOs are making these really sweeping statements and predictions about how AI is going to produce, huge impacts across industries. The term white collar bloodbath has been used, as I think many of us have heard, but it's going to, impact all different kinds of workers. And that somehow this technology is just inevitable. And I think what's really important to remember is that workers are always shaping technology in the workplace in a lot of different ways. And so it's important that we center the agency of working people within all of our different policy solutions and our research. And Anuli's paper does that so well by focusing on workers in Atlanta. So I think in addition to that, as the report really gives such a useful terminology for understanding how tech companies benefit from this really kind of vague definitions of AI and what upskilling is meant to do and what is the purpose of this. This concept of strategic abstraction is really helpful, I think. And hearing directly from workers really like cuts away a lot of the abstraction that comes from tech companies about the products that they're profiting from and the impact they will have when you hear directly from workers who are impacted by this technology, seeing how it's being rolled out and involved in some of these education programs, they can really speak to what's happening on the ground rather than, in the corporate headquarters. I think another point that's really important to keep in mind is how a lot of workers are training and doing these programs as the report says to get a foot in the door only to find that the door leads only to short-term low wage and unsteady work. In the research that we've done at TechEquity on the tech industry, we've seen how this industry that's producing the technology across industries itself has a labor process that benefits greatly from contract work and all of the inequities that result from contract labor versus full-time employment in the industry. And so it's really important to think about like, we're telling everyone to go learn AI skills and all this other kind of stuff, but there's a big question of like, what kinds of jobs are people being prepared for? There's a great report also from the Century Foundation last year that talked about how often some of the workforce training development programs end up as, quote, a publicly subsidized recruitment and training mechanism for firms that rely on high churn, low wage labor model with no clear pathway to professional advancement or upward mobility. Um, and so all of that to say that an alternative to this kind of approach is something that really does center workers in this whole the whole narrative. We need to take that question seriously and the question of the power differential that exists between employers and workers and make sure that we're creating policies and programs that actively seek out worker voice and make sure that workers have are in the driver's seat with some of this. And yeah, I think I'll kind of end on that note that it's really important to consider that aspect of things when we're designing these kinds of programs.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Tim, especially your point of when it comes to kind of broad phrases of what's being said from like tech industry, people who are high up of this white collar bloodbath, the way that this is just going to impact workers in wide swaths. And then with that, I think kind of giving a very general answer to that of AI literacy. People should know about AI and then it'll help them, navigate this bloodbath. It'll help them, advance themselves with this monstrous transformation that society is going to go through. And Annabelle, I'm excited to have you here because I think within these like broad strokes that are being said about not only the impacts of AI, but what the related solutions are to it, you actually have like experience on the ground of really engaging with workers, of actually providing the type of reskilling programs that would actually like really help them. And so with that, and Inuli really highlights that in the report, your a program Data Works with the Georgia Institute of Technology. And so I'd love for you to tell us more about DataWorks and like what makes it unique compared to other training initiatives. And, also again, when there's kind of these like broad strokes being made where you're kind of seeing and learning on the ground, actually providing that type of reskilling.
Thank you so much, Serena. And again, I'm only going to echo Tim here, but this is such an amazing report and accompanying policy brief, and I'm very grateful to have the chance to speak with you all. Um, yeah, and I'm here as one member of the DataWorks research team, and so there's a number of other I've now graduated, but a number of other PhD students are advisors, in particular Dr. Betsy DeSalvo, and the whole DataWorks actually office team. So that's in particular Justin Booker, who's kind of running the show, and Dana Priest, who really runs the training now. Um, yeah, DataWorks is, I think, in large part formulated as a response to what seems like the never-ending onslaught of AI and automation. And so DataWorks is kind of funny because on one hand, we're creating and preparing actually data sets that are going to be used by AI systems. So we have a whole range of clients. Some of them are civic and nonprofit organizations around the city, and some are, for example, more kind of traditional corporate or academic clients who are like, we want to create a generative AI system to do X, Y, Z, and can you help us create this data set or clean up this data set? Um, and so on the one hand, there's a lot of actual data preparation for those systems. On the other hand, DataWorks takes on a lot of things that just still can't be automated. So one of the things is cleaning up, for example, lists of addresses. So nonprofits have a lot of lists of addresses from donors or in different spaces where they're active. And those things still, generative AI does not do a very good job of that because there's a lot of contextual information. And so historically, the workers, and when I say workers, I really mean the data fellows who are employed on a one-year fellowship, fully compensated with health insurance. Folks are full employees of Georgia Tech at that point, with all the wonderful benefits that come with that. And so when the data fellows are working on these data sets, again, it's things that maybe you truly can't automate, which is, again, there's a kind of irony there. Um, and so DataWorks is this kind of work training program. I mentioned this one-year fellowship with a lot of support for job placement. My colleague Laura Karki has worked a lot on, for example, when folks go through this one-year program, what are they going to do afterwards? And what does job placement look like? And I mentioned this sort of data services provider component, where again, we're doing a lot of the work for organizations and nonprofits, but also sort of commercial and academic requesters. And then a big piece of DataWorks is fundamentally that it is an engaged workplace. Sometimes we fall short of our goals, but on the best days, I'm really proud of the way the organization has evolved. Um, and that is to say that the data fellows are bringing in their perspective and lived experience into the kind of data work that they're doing. And so I think in contrast to a lot of the narrative that we get around AI, which is you need, for example, generative AI to sort of do your work, the data fellows are really experts in how are these data sets getting assembled and what do they represent? And if generative systems are being trained off of them, what stories and narratives are being left out? And sometimes it's people and events and places that are missing. And so the data fellows really act in sort of a responsible AI role in different kinds of projects. It looks a little bit different, but working with requesters who are our clients to say, yeah, you're asking us to label this data set in a particular way, but hey, we understand the fundamentals of how a machine learning system works. And actually, here's some tweaks that you might want to consider. And that to me is really, really important. Um, yeah, again, it's a massive effort, and I'm just happy that I get to explain my little share of it, particularly as it relates to machine learning.
Absolutely. And it's so interesting to hear like more about your program and the type of skills that y'all offer. And it's also interesting, like you said, the things that can't be automated, which like you said is an interesting kind of irony in this time, but also the importance of that. And also what else shouldn't be automated, but is, people think of it as it can be, even if it really isn't. With that, I was wondering, Anuli, your work really pointed to DataWorks as an example of a positive reskilling program about, like you said, a 1-year fellowship that actually provides paid training opportunities, access to healthcare due to being under the Georgia Institute of Technology. And I was wondering, Aduli, if you could just explain more of how your analysis of the AI literacy system from a labor, race, and tech perspective really brought you to be able to see what is actually needed for workers to actually like successfully engage in reskilling and upskilling, and like why that's important when we're thinking of AI literacy initiatives and AI policy.
Absolutely. I think one thing that impressed me about DataWorks in particular was that it met a lot of the needs that the workers in other programs I spoke with had. While many programs tend to be financially free at like no financial cost to the worker, they do cost something, right? It's the time to do it while they tend to be during business hours where you could be making money or trying to find a way to make money, but instead you're doing this program that is free, but there's no guarantee or a promise of a job at the end. So you're taking a big risk to do this multi-week, multi-month program during traditional working hours, and you're not sure what comes at the end of it. So I think what DataWorks offers is that security the workers need. Like they need to know where the next check is coming from. Benefits are great. That's something that's becoming rarer to have in this job market in which more work is becoming precarious gig or contract work. So the benefits and also the components of learning while you earn is something that people appreciated too. So they do have client work, as Annabelle said, but I've also learned how they do job training and other like job preparation training and other educational elements for a segment of their time each week in the program. So it's like a mixture of you get to work and you're seen as a professional in this professional environment, but you also get to be a student. And that, for me, only the people that learned about AI or had an AI training program through their job, so more like white collar workers, were the ones that were able to learn while they earned that I spoke with. So DataWorks feels like it's an in between those two kinds of workforce training programs that I came across in the study. The ones for blue collar workers are definitely different than the ones for white collar workers. And it's already stratified by that in ways that maybe people don't really initially consider until I frame it in the report that way.
Yeah, I think that's particularly poignant because even in the Department of Labor's AI literacy framework that they just put out, they really highlight like the importance of workers of like being able to experiment with generative AI systems, like learn how to prompt well and things of that nature. But even how they talk about the training to me, it kind of feels like a white collar opportunity or like that like on the job is where I could like, like, oh, how did this AI system work? If I was doing policy with blah blah blah. Or being able to experiment. But if you're not said for a lot of white collar workers, they're able to on the job have that opportunity for experimentation. Where it seems like for folks who are trying to actually reskill and get new skills, being actually provided like the true infrastructure to learn and not having to do that outside of work or having to not actually take paid training opportunities or paid opportunities to learn. So that was really poignant to me in your report. And Tim, I wanted to bring that to a question to you because thinking of Anuli, of what you're talking about, of people needing paid training opportunities, of actually examining AI literacy from a worker-centered standpoint of like what are they actually experiencing on the ground, and thinking of that worker-centered aspect, I'm wondering for you, like the opportunities of labor unions to really like play a role in facilitating AI literacy efforts in a way that really protects workers, more of at a kind of more macro vantage point than again just like the individual worker opportunity. I was wondering if you could speak more to that from your report.
Sure, yeah. This is definitely something we address and lift up in the report. And also, I just wanted to do a special shout out to Carrie Pellerty, who helped us write this report, and Swati Chintala, our labor researcher from our team. This is really a collaborative effort, as so many of these papers are. And yeah, I think, going back to the issue of workers just needing more voice in a lot of these discussions. Unions, of course, are kind of like the most effective countervailing force for employers to provide a voice for workers on the job. And they do that both through kind of initiatives like training programs, but also through the collective bargaining process that gives workers, and they've been negotiating around workplace technology for decades to provide legal protections for workers who are within unions about the ways that technology will be used in the workplace. So that's really important. And then for years, of course, unions have developed effective workforce training models through registered apprenticeships. That's something that we also highlight in the report. Um, and they like part of the thing that I think is so important is that they're because workers are at the table, they're considering the actual work process and the ways in which technology shows up at work. Annabelle was kind of like hitting at the point of like a lot of times the people who are actually doing the work and are the most close to the technology that's being implemented in different workplaces have a lot of thoughts and a lot of insight into how the technology could enhance work rather and also like the interests of the employer rather than just being imposed on workers in a way that does not allow them the opportunity to have agency over the use of these tools. So that is often baked into these. There's also kind of more of an understanding about the broader labor market and what kind of jobs workers will be entering through and after an apprenticeship program. And of course, unions play such an active role in lifting standards across workforces and across industries through collective bargaining. And I would say that also, so first of all, we already have examples of this happening. And then we also have examples of increasingly unions are incorporating language that relates to training and protecting jobs from displacement through AI in the collective bargaining process as well. And then the last point I would just make about this is also that unions are also often coming up with their own AI principles about their perspective on how AI should, or should not be used in workplaces. And it's worth noting that the AFL-CIO and others have recently put out principles that include developing worker-centered workforce development and training systems as part of this. So there's a lot that can be drawn directly from the experience over decades of unions launching effective apprenticeship programs, as well as the current work they're doing and the visions they're presenting for the future about how technology should be used to enhance labor rather than extract as much as possible.
For sure. And it's interesting thinking of, like you said, like how much unions can give or like empower to like really protect workers. And actually, Anuli, I wanted to bring this back to you real quick because what I really appreciate about in your report is using Atlanta as a critical site to think about the current reality of work, the future of work. And something you really highlight is, Atlanta has a rich history. Georgia has a really rich history. One of those histories is it coming first for business, but like not being good for labor and not being good for collective bargaining and actually being a lot of attacks on that. And so I was wondering if you could just speak more to that of like the reality of Atlanta, but also like why we should pay attention to it, even as folks who may not be based there, of the type of fight that's happening there and how that's relevant to, our current moment, especially with like tech and worker rights.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I mean, I have a personal interest in studying the South, right? Because so much of our labor systems and how we work today is informed by the like plantation labor, right? From the past. We are still just living in this world where our homework and the work that we do at home is separated from our field work. Like even as an anthropologist, I encounter this kind of historical past every day because what I do is field work. And it's very jarring as like a Black woman studying the American South to say I'm doing field work. So I think the South has an interesting history and Atlanta's current present history is fascinating to me because it is a city that is really good at marketing itself. If you think about it, um, back after in the Reconstruction era after the Civil War, like Atlanta had to rebuild and rebrand. It's a city that its bird is the phoenix because it has, risen from the ashes of its own destruction. It has been burned and rebuilt and time again. And I think this AI age is another way that the city is trying to rebuild itself as, in many words, they've used the Silicon South or a top 5 tech hub. The city is good at branding itself because if you think about it from like the perspective of Southern cities rising up, it is it is a city in the middle of the state, right? It's like land blocked, right? There's no water for shipping and things like that. It's more like the red dirt, the red clay, which is really hard to like grow crops on, and the train, the terminus, right? So how else do you market a city? Atlanta has really used its talent. And that's why I heard time and time again, what distinguishes Atlanta from other cities? It's the talent. And they use that a lot in their marketing. Even the Metro Chamber, still, if you go on their page, you'll see that it's a focus on the people of Atlanta as workers and this young and diverse workforce ready to work. That is the same language that we've been using since the Reconstruction era. And in the South, in Georgia particularly, has among the lowest wages in the country, and a population that known as historically Black in Atlanta, but it's beginning to like change a little bit, but still majority Black in Atlanta. So it's very interesting to have uh, Atlanta be known in one hand as a city that influences everything, and it does. And we see like the celebrity and the music and the entertainment industry. But on the other flip side of that is that Atlanta is the capital of income inequality in the US. It remains that consistently, and we have a very large wealth gap between white households and Black households. But because Atlanta is so good at branding itself, you might know it as a place for large conferences. You might know it for the music industry. You might know it for the beautiful mirrors, the kind of murals all over town that like look aesthetically nice, but people can't afford to live in the apartment building right nearby. So it's a city of contradictions, as many are. But I think what makes it so interesting is how it was able to grow. And that's why I study it. How was it able to grow and market itself to get to the point where it could host an Olympic Games in 1996, right? And now is one of the cities hosting the World Cup 2026. There's a lot of through lines to seeing how the city has changed in that time period. And as a researcher, I think there's so much more I can do in Atlanta to kind of study these things and bring them up to national trends, because things that start in the South tend to go nationally. And that's, again, why I study the South.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that in. And I always think it's interesting, and kind of like you said, especially being a Black woman in the field, it's always interesting of thinking of AI policy and all these things we're fighting for, especially want to improve worker rights, people's rights in general, people not being harmed by AI. It's like, Dr. Christina Sharp talks about living in the wake. And part of that living in the wake is living in the aftermath of slavery, living in the aftermath of the plantation. But oftentimes, AI policy is kind of really divorced from that. We treat it as a very kind of ahistorical fight, something that is, a new technology that's super futuristic. It doesn't engage in the current moment of which it actually is, which is of a lot of discrimination, you know, economic opportunity that is not equally, sorted amongst the populace. So I appreciate you bringing that into the conversation. And I guess when I think of also that empowerment of workers, it's really interesting with the Department of Labor's AI literacy framework because they kind of treat it as like you should know generative AI, and with that, what workers need to know, again, as I said earlier, it's just like how to prompt it, like how to use it in your day-to-day life and how to use that well. They also say responsibly use it, which I thought was very interesting. But also, what does it mean to like responsibly use AI when we're not allowed to talk about issues of bias and discrimination, like due to the tax from the federal government? So it's also another problem with it as well. But Annabelle, I wanted to bring that question particularly to you because I think what's impressive about DataWorks is you are giving them, and the program is giving fellows like real digital skills or like actually like data annotation, like just like more technical things that I think for me I would kind of expect from like an AI literacy training. So I'm wondering your thoughts on this kind of direction that the Department of Labor put out, where it's not really the technical skills that they're providing to allow people to really shape AI systems or like, really investigate them to kind of go behind the mirror, just more so being able to use them and prompt them how they are.
Yeah, there's a lot to go into there. I would say, I mean, just to begin with, my personal pet peeve is when we talk about AI, yes, we're usually talking about machine learning. In fact, we're talking about deep learning, we're talking about neural networks, we're talking about a very specific class of technology. As someone who's been studying AI for a while, there's a lot of stuff that happened before that. And there have been a lot of historic critiques of AI that tend to evolve over time and sort of match the new technology. But are eerily reminiscent of things we're hearing now. And in fact, I teach a class now at Bard that is the history of AI. And we start at the Cold War, and students kind of go like, AI happened in, I don't know, 2023 when ChatGPT came out. And it's like, oh no, we're much actually earlier than that. And I think that's something that I see in these new guidelines, unfortunately, is that AI is being taken kind of for granted as, oh, it's this tool. You don't need to know really how it works, but you just need to know how to use it. And I think that's a really sort of dangerous path to go down. And I mean, specifically to make this somewhat, well, I mean, everything's political, but to make this rather overtly political, our AI companies of today control a vast supply chain, but it's a few companies in control. There are some rather overt political statements that have been made by the heads of those companies. And I think the technology that results So here at Bard, we have a number of students that are active in the written and performing and studio arts. And so I think those students come into my classroom and they're like, yeah, we actually really are kind of fundamentally uncomfortable with AI because what it means about the theft of somebody else's, for example, written work or imagery or something like this. And so I think when I look at these guidelines, the first thing that sort of hits me is that did AI have to evolve in the way that it evolved? And when we're talking about AI, are we actually talking about the suite of tools that are offered by a very small handful of companies and to, who benefits actually off of those tools being, rather popularly used? And I think there are some very notable additions to this and things like, for example, the big tech CEOs all being present at the inauguration and at some more recent White House events related to AI. It's very clear sort of what motivations exist. Um, and I think when I reflect on DataWorks and so I created and taught the first version of our sort of critical AI literacy. It had a few different names it was going by. The first thing was actually to understand, okay, what is pattern matching? And do we trust a system that knows how to pattern match with things that might have much bigger significance? For example, something like content moderation. And so if you're trying to figure out on a social media platform, what is harmful speech? And then very quickly you get into oh, well, who's creating these rules and embedding these rules, in these systems? I just saw a piece about, I think it was whatever the current model of Claude is right now. And it was about the sort of one woman who was behind teaching Claude how to be a good person, which, takes for granted. I'm not convinced that Claude is a person or should be, even trying to represent a person. That's a whole nother conversation we can have. But I think it's very concerning to me that, okay, there's one individual that's, being rather overtly placed as sort of the voice of moral reason. And that's just not something I'm comfortable with. And I think that's something that we get into at DataWorks is how do you negotiate your own expertise, but as a way of saying, and your own lived experience as a way of saying, okay, I can give you, a couple of different perspectives on this, but there are how many more perspectives that are being left out of the room? And I think with all this stuff, it really starts with the data. If you're creating a generative system, your system is trained off of or reinforced with a data set. The data fellows are experts in data, and that's some of the most interesting conversations I have seen at DataWorks is the data fellows saying, hey, you're asking me to do this particular data annotation task in this particular way. And as a data person, that doesn't really match or that sort of has concerning implications down the road, or here are things you might be, missing or that you should think about. And so, yeah, I look at these guidelines and I'm not sold, and I'm very convinced about the motivations and attitudes that they represent. And I also think it's kind of ridiculous that these sort of big tech CEOs get to say, hey, we created these couple of systems and tools, and now it's up to everybody else to figure out how to use them. I'm just not convinced that that is the way that we should be handling this problem, I guess.
Absolutely. No, absolutely agree. Yeah, especially not just we have to just deal with it. And actually, I find it really poignant. One of the class of history of AI. I think that's really interesting. But like you said, connecting it so much to before Chat GPT and really to like the 1950s or even a little bit beforehand. And that was interesting because I think even working in policy, there's been such a shift in the conversation since generative AI really came upon the scene. And I think even the fortunate thing of that is even so much, knowledge that people have produced on like AI ethics and bias and all that. I feel like we're kind of ignored or people act like it didn't apply to the situation where it's like it applies. We've been studying these issues for a long time, which is a whole other conversation to dive into, but I feel like you really get into that. But Tim, I was actually wondering for you, like dealing with these issues of a historicity, like within the AI policy conversation, and then also to Annabelle's point of, people just being positioned as, you deal with it. We put this technology out there, you deal with it, and try to reskill or upskill or do what you need to. I guess I'm wondering like what you see right now is the opportunities or current levels on the state or federal levels to advance workforce development initiatives that really center workers and also just to provide protections that people really need. I feel like government is the bridge or should be the bridge to actually provide the protections when industry is just kind of like doing its thing. Like industry's job is to kind of do its thing, but government's the one who should protect workers. So yeah, I would love to hear more from you about that.
Yeah, and I think like what we've seen over the years is like companies have reduced a lot of their internal workforce training budgets that would allow, pathways to prosperity like within one workplace and address a lot of the issues that Anuli has raised about how like this is just something that workers have to do in addition to everything else that they're working on, and they're not getting this training in most circumstances within the context of their current employment. And so as a result, I think what you also get is a lot of tech companies that profit from the sale of this technology and the expansion of it, and in fact need more employers to implement their tools as a way to justify the massive capital expenditure they're spending on data centers and the physical infrastructure of AI. Instead, what they can do is say, they make commitments to like $1 million for this, $1 million for that, for some kind of like education training thing. And it seems like we're ending up again in one of these like everyone learn to code moments where a lot of people are spending a lot of their own time and money trying to figure out how to spend, their time on something that will lead to a career advancement. But we're just kind of flooding a market that is already reliant on precarious gig work with people who have some kind of credential, but it may or may not lead to better outcomes or life improvement in general. So I think like one thing to keep in mind too is that and this gets to the historicity. Hey, okay, you can say it. But the lack of historical context here is that AI, is one we're talking about often just generative AI, one specific thing. The labor futures team at Data and Society has done such a good job for many years of raising how digital technologies impact workers in so many different ways. So we're talking about algorithmic management, automated decision-making systems, monitoring technology, the ways that hiring tech can increase bias, all this other kind of stuff. I think state legislators have really been very active on this front, where the federal level has kind of lagged a bit. Where a lot of state legislators and I'll just mention Annetta Bernhardt and Michelle Kahn at UC Berkeley Labor Center have done a great job tracking state level policy on the intersection of labor and technology and have identified very common themes across like hundreds of bills across many different states where state legislators are trying to give workers more power and address a lot of the issues that we're talking about with respect to how technology impacts workers. So that's a great resource for folks to check out. And then one other thing I really wanted to mention is that when we think about governance, we don't also only need to think about the legislature, either on the federal level or on the state level. There's a great paper by Raphael Groman called Worker-Led AI Governance, which looks specifically at the Hollywood workers' strike, but it really raises this whole great point that like AI is also governed from below by workers themselves through collective organizing and collective bargaining and action even without the context of unions in many different workplaces too. So that is a different form of workers exerting governance over AI technology and how it is how it affects all of us as well.
Absolutely. And with this, I want to get to some of the audience Q&As, and everyone feel free to keep pouring some in. Uh, George Edwards actually put a question forward about the increasing prevalence of the AI bubble talk. Kind of wondering if there's growing awareness among executives of like, generative AI isn't really working as it should, which we do about that. But I actually kind of want to add to this question of like, with this kind of prevalence of the AI bubble talk, do y'all feel that, I mean, is there an interesting way that this could impact this kind of like AI literacy push? Like people are talking about the need for it, but at the same time, I think there's also a lot of people really contending with the fact that maybe this isn't all that it's meant to be. I'd be interested if anyone would want to address that in the AI bubble concept.
Yeah, sure. I remember last year I was in DC for a talk or a seminar on AI and labor, but it was hosted by like economists. So I was like the lone anthropologist in the room, and I was like, "Is this a bubble? Is it a speculative market?" And it like I do recall the room being silent. It was crickets in that room. And I asked those questions because. Is it that AI is inevitable, or did you spend a lot of money up front and you want a return on your investment? So in order to get that return on your investment, we all have to learn AI and be literate in AI and use the tools. That is why the Department of Labor's framework is so focused on generative AI, because that's an accessible, sellable tool that anyone can get a subscription to and buy and help these industry partners who, like we said, were at the inauguration, right? So I do think it's all connected. I mean, if AI is going to be a part of our lives, yes, we should know what it is, and training programs do a lot of meaningful work in helping people learn new things, but there is economic motivation behind it, right? Because we have to help these companies recoup the billions of dollars, literally say groundbreaking investments, unprecedented substantial investments that they've made into impacting or into making us adopt AI into every aspect of our lives. We can't even type an email without some type of AI suggestion or go on search on Google without it. So yeah, money has to be made, and we as workers remain the money makers, except we don't actually have the money. I want to make that distinction. We just make it for others.
I would just echo all of that and say, I think when we talk about the bubble, which I don't know, I have a wager going in my office about when the bubble happens, so I won't reveal the details of that too much. But I think it's coming at some point. And I think as someone with an interest in sort of the history of technology, the question will be, will AI just fade away, or will it become kind of a normal technology that we take for granted? So I offer the example that when my mother was in high school, she learned to code in, I believe it was either COBOL. I think it was COBOL. She doesn't remember any of it. And I think has never tried to program since, but has this like tiny background idea of maybe how some of the stuff I do works, enough to be able to kind of make fun of me sitting in front of the computer all day. And I would be interested to know, and I think there was a huge push, and I use this as one example. There have been different points where I think that we've looked particularly to the education system and said, okay, you've got to learn XYZ thing. It will become inevitable. Will it become a background thing that we take for granted? I'm concerned about the implications of that, particularly from an ecological standpoint. And I've seen a few sort of comments in the Q&A here about some of the, in particular, and very relevant to this report, the environmental racism, and where data centers are being placed and who's impacted by that, and particularly when they're in the United States versus internationally. And so I think that's really concerning to me. I'm also curious if the sort of economic future is really there in terms of, huge investments have to be made. This stuff is really expensive to get even the marginal gains on accuracy and improvement. It's so expensive now. And I'm not sure that this is something that actually can sort of be furthered. We might truly hit kind of this has happened, right? With my history of AI class, we're about to talk about the second AI winter. Are we just headed for a third AI winter where things plateau? Some new sort of technical paradigm might come out and we might pick things up again in a few years, or we might just plateau. I'm not sure, but I think it's maybe not as rosy as Silicon Valley would have us believe.
Absolutely. And I think it's interesting your point of, and yeah, I noticed that in the questions here too of connecting it to environmental racism, connecting this conversation of AI literacy to data centers. And to me, a parallel I see in both of those is like both of them being forced to push upon people to, as you all said, just further AI development and AI investment and making it seem like this will be beneficial when like even the research we've done through our trustworthy infrastructures team on data centers, and then also what you've done with AI literacy is both of them, you look kind of at the end and you're like, it's not mathing. The math isn't there on what those true investments are, but the harms are often very present. So that's kind of the irony of it. And with that, I wanted to get to a Q&A question. Who was asking a question of, this narrative of AI literacy, does it include all the stories of all of the participants? And they really highlight, again, the data workers in the global south doing labeling, annotating work, data centers affecting communities in South America. They said if we're talking about literacy in any way, I think it should be those type of conversations, the history therein, and narratives from those directly affected, but not invited to the big table. And I wanted to highlight that because to me, I think what they're also showing is, and I'd really be interested in this because when I hear about AI literacy, I don't see it really diving into those conversations or talking about impact on the global majority or how the global majority is also like contending with AI literacy. But I see AI literacy as very much a nationalist project of this is to uplift American workers and contribute to, the benefit of America becoming an AI leader. And so to me, it's very much connected with nationalism, which is why to me, I'm not surprised that it doesn't often encompass other workers who are very much feeding into the AI ecosystem that we have that we rely on. But I'd be interested for y'all, what are you seeing in that? Are you seeing those conversations being included or not?
I will say just for like my research again, it's like based in the US, based in Atlanta, but I do reference a scholar, Jai Vipra, and their work in India in the report and how they talk about, and I think this is across different countries. It's a nationalistic imperative for each individual country to participate in this AI arms race by getting their residents of that country to become AI literate. And what Jai Vipra writes in their piece about it is that as more and more people gain this competency or are able to use AI or become prompt engineers, what have you, that now you have a larger pool of people can do it, and then because the pool is larger, they'll use industry and governments will use that as an impetus to pay people less because it's now less of a specialized skill. So it's almost like that catch-22 is that even as more people develop that skill set and learn it, its value on the market declines because it's not as specialized anymore. And that's when in the report I begin to examine the differences and maybe even class and stratification around like prompt engineering versus vibe coding and who gets to say that they do what, because prompt engineering and vibe coding are not inherently that different. They are asking a query or querying to generate a response or generate something and somehow, but there are, I would say, and maybe this is another project, the class distinctions between the vibe coder and the prompt engineer and what that will look like moving forward and what do these titles even mean and what kind of value do they elicit. So I think there's so much to do in this like AI literacy space because so much is unknown, but ultimately is a strategy that puts the onus on the workers to adapt, right? Instead of making sure that industry and government actually is held responsible and accountable for the decisions they make that impact our lives.
I'd love to jump in quickly on Anuli. I think you nailed it. Totally, I agree completely. And we've done at TechEquity, we did a report last year with Alphabet Workers Union and the Communication Workers Union, interviewing US-based data workers, doing not at DataWorks, but at the more mainstream companies that like Scale AI, these kinds of companies that are doing annotation and labeling for AI systems, and found that they have a lot of the same work issues here in the US as their counterparts throughout the global majority. But just as another example of exactly the dynamic that Anuli is talking about, Kenya, for example, similar to the way that Atlanta has branded and marketed itself to appeal to the tech industry, has used the term the Silicon Savannah, just like the Silicon South, as a different way. They've also like adapted their like legal infrastructure related to business processing outsourcing to be more friendly to companies that want to outsource technology and content moderation and data work to their country. And we're seeing a very similar thing play out where a lot of the big data work companies talk about how right now, like a lot of the basic level of content moderation and kind of like annotation and this kind of work they say has already been done. And it's been done by these workers in the global south. And now what they need is people with very particular niche industry expertise, like people with PhDs and like science and medicine and things like that. And so they're turning back to workers in the global north to try to like, reach that kind of insight. And our understanding from speaking with workers who do this work, who have advanced degrees in the US, is that the work itself is structured in a way that does not take advantage of their expertise anyway. So they are here like working, jobs where they're making low wages, they're like, don't have agency over the work process itself to be able to use the great education and the skills and the resources and knowledge they're bringing to the table with these companies. And then this is all being used to train these systems that are then ultimately supposed to replace human workers in other industries as well. So I think this is mostly a false narrative in the data work section of the industry, but we're seeing something very similar replicate itself where so many workers throughout the global south, contributed massively to the wealth of these companies and their power and influence. And now the companies just know that they have what Mark Graham calls a planetary labor market, where they can just source workers at the turn of a dime from anywhere. That is, the cheapest and easiest for them to exploit.
And to follow up on that super briefly, I think it's really interesting the response that we've gotten with DataWorks, because DataWorks is fundamentally located in the United States, specifically in Atlanta. There are several projects that I know of. So one is it's a styled on a workers observatory. It's run by Mila Miseli out of Berlin, working with data workers from around the world, mostly I think from the global majority. And I think the stories that get told are things that, so when we tell stories of things that didn't go well at DataWorks, particular interactions with clients or sort of concerning trends that we see, people tend to listen to us. And it helps that, the research team is positioned in academia at an institute of technology. People tend to,
Mhm.
if we weaponize our PhDs, then at least this time it's for good or something like that. But I think it's really concerning to me the broader trend of people who are doing this kind of work and this kind of data annotation labor are not listened to and are only increasingly marginalized. So that's one thing we hope with DataWorks, is to offer sort of a model for it doesn't have to be like this. There are different ways, and there are ways to sort of honor and respect people's expertise.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I really appreciate that. And it's interesting, y'all talk about this intersection of like trying to get skills, but also, like Tim, you said, actually leaning towards niche skills and that kind of like niche level of like expertise, like PhDs, et cetera, that often actually just isn't really accessible for most people. But even then doesn't actually create the job guarantees that you'd want. We have 1 minute left, so we don't have too much time. This has been such an enriching conversation. But I wanted to ask just really quickly, someone in the comments really asked that they are pursuing reskilling and are just like having difficulties navigating it. And I was just wondering if y'all had any advice for like, how do you even maybe assess reskilling programs to think of, is this actually helpful for me or not? When we have a moment where people feel the pressure to, reskill and get these technical skills, but there's not actually a promise of where it will deliver or lead them to, especially at Annabel and Anuli, since y'all, and Annabel with your program and Anuli with what you've learned talking with workers.
Check out the DataWorks website. I'll put the link in the chat. We have some public trainings and stuff, and be in touch.
I'll be honest, I think it's a tough question because you want to do what you can on an individual level to be competitive, right, in the labor
Mhm.
market, but there are also things on a structural level that make that difficult. And what I found is that even if you learn how to do like a resume that the applicant tracking systems will allow through and things like that, um, like will you get a job in the end? I find that so many people these days get jobs through their personal relationships. And I think despite
Mhm.
the like focus on these platforms and technologies, your next job might come from your local network or somebody that knows somebody. So I would probably lean into that and tapping into those resources in addition to doing your work. So at least you're covering the bases
Mhm.
of what you can do on an individual level, but how can your community also show up for you and you show up for them at this time? Because that's all we're really going to have for these years ahead is truly each other until policy, until industry and government, catch up or wake up to our needs.
I think it's a great note to end on. Yeah, in the midst of all this technological push for technological change, it often is each other who we have, and also focusing on our own rights and protecting our rights and uplifting them as workers, as individuals. And with that, that really brings us to the end of this webinar. Thank you to the panelists for this enriching conversation, for diving deeply into AI literacy and the AI literacy trap, how it impacts workers, and all the mechanisms and forces behind it. And also, thank you to everyone for tuning in today. I want to plug a recent piece that was written actually by Anuli and folks at Data and Society on building civic strength for an AI era. And with this, as we talk about the push for AI literacy, but actually wanting people to be empowered, we point towards the direction of AI civics, which really is about really empowering people to be able to engage in AI with AI in a critical way. Also, to learn more about Data and Society, you can subscribe to our weekly newsletter and follow us on Blue Sky Social. Thank you, everyone.